Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Transfigured. I am very excited today. I am here with Professor Troels Engberg-Pedersen. He is a professor emeritus of New Testament from the University of Copenhagen. You have a very impressive resume with time at Oxford and all the other sort of various places that a prestigious New Testament scholar could be associated with. You have numerous books. We're going to be mainly talking about a book called John and Philosophy, but you also have books, Cosmology and the Self and the Apostle Paul, Beyond the Judaism-Hellenism Divide, Paul and the Stoics, From Stoicism to Platonism. And your work, I guess I could say, generally focuses on sort of the philosophical context of the New Testament. And
That is entirely right.
that is sort of your specialty. So do you want to introduce yourself a little bit?
Sure. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you for inviting me here. It's fascinating to be on this program. And I do have, as you said, very close contact with, among other things, the United States. I've been at Yale 2 semesters, and I think I have also been at the annual SBL meeting about 30 times, so I have learned a lot from interaction with the United States. Well, my sort of background and why I went into this in this particular way, that's a good question, because at my age one really begins to think about such things. And the fact is that I grew up on a Danish folk high school. That probably doesn't mean anything to you, but it's a very important institution in Denmark, where everybody can come for 4 months or 6 months or something like that. Normally people between 18 and 25, but also older people. And my father was, and they don't take any degrees or anything, they just have study issues that are of contemporary importance. My father was a headmaster of 2 of those folk high schools. Traditionally, they have a sort of, Christian background 150 years ago, but they are enormously open to all developments within culture, and that was the kind of upbringing that I had, and I took as a child, I took very much part in that and learned enormous amount from it.
Would that be maybe comparable to like a Montessori school or something like that? Maybe in the United
Yes,
States?
yeah, that may be the case. I don't know them so much. I don't know whether the Montessori schools have a very specific sort of profile. The folk high schools in Denmark don't. They differ very much, and so it very much depends on which particular school you attend. But after that, my father was enormously interested in antiquity. We are back in the 1950s, and you know, at that time, ancient culture, Greek culture, meant a lot in everyday culture, as it were. And I went with my parents when I was 15 years old on 3 weeks to Greece, and that made an enormous impression on me. So I thought that once I had finished high school, I would study classics at Copenhagen University. And I did that, and then I had a wonderful teacher, Professor Johnny Christensen, who was a specialist in Stoicism in particular. He was also a Christian, but that didn't matter at all in that context. And I learned so much from it that I, was enticed into studying that. So I actually did a lot of classics, of course, and then philosophy also at Oxford in the 1970s. And then eventually it was a matter of where would I want to end up, as it were. And I went into early Christianity and eventually got a full professorship at the University of Copenhagen. And that, as it were, meant, well, it created my profile to try to see how either different or similar. Early Christianity was to or from ancient philosophy. And that set out, as it were, my whole career, and I have enjoyed every second of it.
Well, good, yeah, and I can tell that you enjoy it too, reading your books. So the next question I have is: so as a historian and as a scholar, how do you feel like your work should be used, and I guess also should not be used? I think this is something that we sort of corresponded with ahead of time. Like, as you know, my background, I grew up in a non-Trinitarian and also charismatic church, right? Charismatic is in, takes the Holy Spirit very seriously, speaking in tongues, that sort of practice. And when I read your books, I'm like, oh my goodness, this sounds similar to what I was taught growing up, except sort of in more philosophical academic speech. And I guess the question is so how for you as a historian, how do you think that your work should and should not be used, and what relevance does it have to sort of contemporary interests in contemporary Christianity?
This, of course, is an extremely, very, very good question. I don't personally think that anybody would do history or historical research or whatever just like that. On the other hand, I think it's enormously important that if one does want to do historical research, then it should be as good historical research as it possibly can. So I would say that there are two steps in the answer to your question. The first is that what people should listen to or understand when they read my stuff and other stuff of other historians is simply understanding. That is, wanting to know how were things at that time back in history, far away from us. That is interesting in itself. But it is also, of course, interesting in the sense, well, it opens up our horizon. We simply are better informed if we do it like that. But we can also draw some more direct or immediate input from that study. But I think it's very, very important there, and this is the second element in it, that one does it only by analogy. That one thinks, they were thinking about these issues, which we also know quite well, and they gave those answers, that type of answer. Now, is there anything in that we may, as it were, articulate in our modern times, but by analogy? Not, and this leads to the follow-up question, as it were, where does one go wrong if one reads my books about Paul and John or whatever? And there I would say goes wrong. The negative use is to believe that what one finds in the ancient world and what one thinks oneself is identical. That it is the same, the very same, because that is just not, and here I'm speaking as a historian, true. It isn't the same. They didn't live now. They lived in a very different world. We can find similarities and analogies, etc., but it is not identical. And the second negative use of it is then to say that what you find in history supports your own view. I think that very, very, very many people who read the Bible, for instance, they read it in order to find something that will more or less directly support what they themselves believe. And I think there is something lacking in that whole attitude. But on the other hand, and this is the other side, the positive side again, this doesn't mean that we cannot learn something from studying the ancient material. Only it is something that we must articulate on our own terms and, as I say, by analogy. Is that clear enough?
Yeah, that's clear enough. That makes sense. So Sort of related to that, understanding differences in worldviews, understanding differences in how we make sense of the cosmos, how we understand, the universe to behave.
Yeah.
A lot of your work is focused on sort of the differences between Stoicism and Platonism as different philosophical worldviews, and that perhaps Christianity has long been understood too much through sort of a Platonic lens, and applying that to what we read in the New Testament, whereas maybe a more Stoic lens would make sense. Could you sort of explain the relevant differences between Stoicism and Platonism at the time?
And in a few words?
Yeah, in a few words.
Okay. It's a huge topic, of course, but one thing, and I have to say here that the gist of my reply has to be very elementary in order to make any sense here. Basically, I would say Platonism is a dualistic philosophy. There is a sharp distinction between the level of ideas, which is immaterial, and then the physical world, with the sense perceptible world, which is around us, which is material. And it's a huge question, of course, how to understand in Plato himself and in later Platonism the relationship between the ideas and the present world. In fact, this dualism was so difficult to grasp that Plato's immediate pupil and in a way successor, Aristotle, his philosophy is in a way dedicated to giving an answer to that question, how Plato's two worlds are related to one another, that moves him more in the direction of, but no longer than that, a direction of a sort of monistic understanding of the world. But Aristotle remained to some extent a Platonist, so he didn't take the full step. But the Stoics did. And that is the interesting thing. We have Plato, the first half of the 4th century BCE, Aristotle dying in 322 BCE, and then the Stoics come precisely around 300 BCE. And they take this additional step, wanting to focus exclusively on, the present world in all its dimensions. They also want to bring in the dimension on which Plato and Aristotle had placed so much emphasis, namely of, we wouldn't call it ideas, but reason and understanding and concepts, etc. They wanted very much to bring that in. It was just as important for them as it was for Aristotle and Plato, but they wanted to bring it in within a monistic understanding of the world. And that is why they could also find a room for God. God is strongly present in Stoicism. People say, oh yes, he's strongly present in, if we take a late Stoic like the Roman Epictetus, who lived around 100 CE. But he is also God present in the second head of the Stoic school, who was called Cleanthes, and we have from him a hymn to Zeus, that is a hymn to God, in which he explains certain basic ideas of Stoic philosophy as part of that. So that is something that was certainly possible in Stoicism, and it was also, I believe, quite important, because God has a special role within Stoicism as, in a way, gathering it all together. I could explain that in more detail. But it's only to make this point that there was a development from Plato to Aristotle into Stoicism, but it did not mean that the Stoics in any way gave up on some of the basic ideas behind Aristotelianism and Platonism. Was that? Well, that's part of the. That's part of. Perhaps I might want to.
Right. So, Go ahead.
To add one point, which has been very important to me, and which you also partly referred to when you mentioned that book called From Platonism to Stoicism, that if we look at the period after 300 BCE and down to the 1st century BCE, or well, the birth of Christ, the main philosophies were two or three: Epicureanism and Stoicism, but not Platonism or Aristotelianism. That only came gradually into our era. There was a sort of battle going on in the 1st century CE and the 2nd century CE between Stoicism and Platonism. And eventually Platonism won in the 2nd century CE onwards, and then Aristotelianism also was, as it were, reinvented. So in addition to what we spoke about first, namely the distinction within their philosophies as such, there is also a very, very important historical development that one needs to have in mind when one looks at the New Testament.
Mm-hmm. So in Stoicism, God is sort of more in here, right? Sort of in the cosmos, whereas Platonism has more of a God is up there, we're down here.
Absolutely,
sort of.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. In a way, the Stoics would also say that God is up there because they have a sort of layered understanding of the world. And for them, of course, the four elements, starting from below, earth, water, and then air and fire, is to be understood cosmologically. And God is at the top of everything. But he is still very much a part of the world. You may have heard about their idea of how the world is continuously developing and eventually returning into God. And then out of that comes the world once again. So that there's this kind of movement going on within Stoicism, but it only shows that God is definitely a part of that world which he has created.
Mm-hmm. So do you want to talk a little bit about how the Stoics understood pneuma and logos?
Oh yes, very much so, because it's central to what I have been trying to say. First, you call it pneuma, I call it pneuma, it doesn't matter. It is what we normally translate as spirit. I always put spirit into scare quotes, because whenever we hear something about spirit or spiritual, we are immediately Platonists. That is, we think that this must be something immaterial somewhere else. But it is not in Stoicism. Pneuma is a material, something that is put together, according to them, by air and a special type of fire, which is very close to God, in fact, a refined type of fire. And that means then that this pneuma is able to go through everything in the present world, and in fact to keep everything in the present world together. So there's pneuma everywhere, and this is, in fact, we might say, God's basic tool of both creating the world and also keeping it going. But,
right, it's like the animating force of the world
precisely.
That's in the world. You can't see it, but you can see its effects, and it's what's sort of animating everything.
Precisely. One could say also that it is a kind of energy, and I think the term energy is quite good, because it expresses both, as you say, that it's everywhere, sort of, and also that it is some kind of material, something. But that's only the first half of it, because that is precisely the material side. But then there is also the other side, which is the logos, which means reason, rationality, that is just as important, according to the Stoics, as it was, as I explained previously, for Aristotle and Stoic. And that is a cognitive thing. That has something that has to do with our ways of understanding the world. And the main point about Stoicism is that pneuma and logos are, in a way, the same thing, only looked at from two different sides. One as a material energy, and the other as reason, rationality, the meaning of the world, as it were.
Right. So the universe is kind of energized and activated by pneuma that's in everything, but it has a order and a reason and a rationality and a coherence to it.
Yeah.
And that's the logos side of the pneuma.
That's right.
Thing.
That's right. Also, one can add here that the world is a bit the way you have just described it, but it's also the case that within the world, and in fact in human beings, the Stoics were not very interested in non-human animals, as it were, and that's a little sad, but never mind. In human beings, the pneuma and logos are present in a particularly strong manner. They speak of tonos, which means tension, and the idea is that there is tension in the world as a whole. That is what keeps this energy kind of thing going, as it were. But there is also in human beings a particularly strong type of tension, and that is what enables us human beings to think of everything in the world to the furthest borders of the world. We can think of that. We can think back in time. We can, etc., etc. That's all. Everywhere. It's because of this tension of the logos and the pneuma, and that, in fact, is what, according to the Stoics, make us similar to God. Now, one has to say that they are talking there about the ideal human being. They call him the wise man, and the wise man is as rare as the phoenix bird. One never knows whether he has been around, etc. But he's very close, therefore, thus understood, to God. But we, the rest of humanity, have a possibility of moving more and more closer and closer to that kind of person, the wise man, and thus to understand that everything in the world which is in fact there and is operating whether we know it or not.
Okay, so that I think is probably that's a too short, but it'll have to do for now.
Yeah, that's right.
Synopsis of Stoicism and its contrast with Platonism. Why do you think that a Stoic philosophical framework would be more appropriate for understanding authors in the New Testament like Paul and John than a Platonic one?
That is, of course, the question in a way, and my answer comes out of studying these writers, Paul and John in particular. That is, I'm not trying to, as it were, or I'm really averse to trying to read Stoicism into these texts. It's always a matter of there are problems of understanding these writers. Can we get a better understanding if we think of what they are saying in terms of Stoicism or something like Stoicism rather than Platonism? I should say that the more I had been working on this, the less have I become interested in. I'm not wanting to say that, say, Paul was a Stoic. He was a Jew, he was an apostle of Christ, etc., etc. That is also very much his own self-understanding. So that's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying that there are specific issues in Paul that are obviously important to him. Similarly, as we will discuss later, I hope, specific issues in John that are very important to him, and we can understand them better if we bring in monistic Stoicism than dualistic Platonism. But this is something we can perhaps look at in more detail.
Sure, and so you sort of, a couple of the points you made is that sort of the rise of Platonism, or sort of like middle and then into Neoplatonism, begins more in the 2nd century.
Yeah.
And obviously these authors are writing in the 1st century. I've also sometimes heard that Tarsus itself was the center of Stoicism.
That's
and
right.
Of course, that being where Paul is from. Do you put much stock in that?
No.
Or?
No, and
No.
for one reason, that in this area, I think the basic criterion must be the following one. Do we understand Paul or John better if we bring in some of these Stoic ideas, no matter where they had picked them up, no matter in a way what the whole cultural situation was like. This thing about Platonism only taking over gradually, etc., that's just a kind of supporting argument. That's not the essential thing. The essential thing is that I want to learn and understand better both Paul and John and others, and I think that it helps there. This is actually something I have learned at Yale from Professor Wayne Meeks. He was famous. He wrote a book about Paul in 1983, I think, a famous book, and he was trying to import insights from modern anthropology and sociology of knowledge, etc., and that worked wonderfully. But he was also engaged in certain battles with other colleagues, and there his point was that he didn't want, to write about sociology of knowledge or whatever. He wrote about Paul. He wanted to use that material to throw light on Paul, and he did that wonderfully. And I see what I'm trying to do more or less sans comparaison. In the same way of using whatever I can, but here I think actually that Stoicism is a good tool to understand either Paul or John.
Great. So I'm going to read Romans 8, 9 through 11.
Ooh.
And then I would appreciate if you could help sort of explain what this passage is saying and how a Stoic metaphysic can help give us some insight, and how this passage sort of illuminates Paul's understanding of the Spirit. So this is Romans 8, 9 through 11. But you are not in the flesh, you are in the Spirit, since the Spirit of God dwells in you. Anyone who does not have the Spirit of Christ does not belong to him. But if Christ is in you, though the body is dead because of sin, the Spirit is life because of righteousness. If the Spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead dwells in you, he who raised Christ from the dead will give life to your mortal bodies also through his Spirit that dwells in you. So what is this passage saying? And how does this help us understand Paul's worldview a little better?
Right. Well, that's a very good question too. And actually, I'm just back from a conference in Vienna last week where we were discussing particularly Romans 8. So we were struggling, among other things, with this particular passage. I think what we see that are relevant for us here are two things. One is that there is a very, very close connection in Paul between ethics and theology, where theology means something that has to do with the future and the resurrection, etc., namely in verse 11. What he is talking about in verses 9 to 10 is precisely ethics, that is the result, the ethical result of their having received the pneuma, and having received it as he is so concerned about saying that it is in their bodies. He says in verse 9, if God's pneuma lives in you, and when he then comes to talk about the future in verse 11, he repeats that again. If the pneuma of the one who raised Jesus from the dead lives in you, he will also, etc., through the body that is living in you. He is so keen on bringing out this in element. Now that is in a slight parenthesis, something that a Platonist really couldn't say. First, Plato didn't really speak much about the pneuma. Aristotle did a bit more in connection with his biology, and then the Stoics took that over and made it into this comprehensive cosmological entity that we spoke about later. But here, the important thing is that this cosmological thing in Paul is in them. And that is one point where I think that one understands Paul, and actually also John, when we come to that, much better if one sees that the ethics and the theology are intimately connected through that kind of cosmology. So that's the first point. The other point I think is very interesting in the light of developments in Christian thought after Paul and John, is that Paul here happily speaks about first God's pneuma, then Christ's pneuma, then Christ himself, then the pneuma that inhabits in you. We couldn't even say it, but he does say it. So he doesn't really distinguish between these two or three types.
In three or four sentences, it's God's pneuma, it's Christ's pneuma, it's the pneuma, and it just is Christ.
Yeah. Right. It's just amazing. And then he goes on 2 or 3 or 5 or 6 verses later to speak about the pneuma itself as something that is to be found between God and Christ in heaven and human beings. It's one might say this is very confusing, but I don't think it's confusing at all. I actually think that if one has this idea that we spoke about of the Stoic-like pneuma that is everywhere, but also a particular tie to human beings. And here we have to add to human beings who actually have faith in Christ, because that is a presupposition for their getting the pneuma. If you think about it in such a, from the perspective of such a comprehensive understanding, then it's quite okay to speak about the pneuma in these 3 or 4 different ways. Whereas, if I may say that already here, the attempt later in Christian thinking of distinguishing very precisely between, like in Trinitarian thinking, or not distinguishing between these 3 entities, God, Christ, and pneuma, is not required. It's not perhaps not even helpful, I don't know, but it's not required in order to understand what Paul is saying in this passage.
Mm-hmm. So kind of maybe to illuminate that and to help sort of get at in what sense is Jesus's spirit the same as God's spirit, or in what sense is the spirit in you the same as Christ in you. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul talks about sort of the contrast between an earthly body and a spiritual body, right? And that Jesus now has a pneumatic body, right? And that in the resurrection, all believers seemingly will have a pneumatic body. Yeah. And he also even says that like when he's comparing Adam and Jesus, right? The first Adam was of the dust, and the second Adam became a life-giving spirit, right? And it's became a life-giving spirit. So how does Jesus, in some sense, get sort of pneumaticized, if that's a word that you could use, or and united with the Spirit, and so how does that work in Pauline theology?
There's a little problem there, because he doesn't actually anywhere speak very precisely about the resurrected Christ as being a pneumatic entity. What he speaks about here in 1 Corinthians 15 is precisely, as you said, ordinary human beings who have Christ faith and who have also, mind you, that's very important, received the pneuma as what is it? An apache.
A down payment.
A down payment, yes, precisely, thank you. They have received that, and they have received it in baptism. He's talking about the way they will eventually then at the resurrection be transformed completely from Well, it is a body. You said an earthly body, and that is in a way entirely correct. But he calls it a psychic body into a pneumatic body, because he also says in the same passage that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. So there has to be this kind of change. He also uses the term change, apalage, several times, a kind of transformation where the psychic body is has finally become completely transformed by the pneuma, which will also become present with particular force at the resurrection. It is already there, and it is already working. This is a little contentious, but we spoke about that also in Vienna. It is in a way already at work in Paul himself. There's a passage in 2 Corinthians 4 where he describes that he both has this body that is dying, but also at the same time a body that is alive and will continue to be alive. So it is there now, but it will become present. The transformation, as it were, will be fulfilled at the resurrection. And I think that is another example of how Stoicism may help one to understand this better. He is very keen on emphasizing 1 Corinthians 15 that it is this incorruptible body that puts on, as he says, incorruption. It is this mortal body that puts on immortality. And that tells me that he really is talking about what Aristotle, in fact, would call substantial transformation. And I find it extremely difficult to see how, if you are a Platonist and think of the ideas, how they could, as it were, transform this particular body in the way that Paul describes it. Anyway.
Yeah, so a spiritual body, it's still you, but it's gone. It's like there's this germinating spiritual body sort of within your psychic body
right now,
right?
Yeah.
And right now there's sort of this both and transitional phase, right? There's the earnest money, but we haven't gotten the full payment, and then at the resurrection, there is this transformation where you become a pneumatic body. But what's a pneumatic body? Are you physical, or can you move around? Are you and what's the difference? And what's this have to do with the heavenly bodies that have their own glory? What's all the connection there?
Right. Two things. Can you move around? Well, here, first I have to say that Paul doesn't say very much about that. I think that if you were to, but this is a little risky, if you were to give an answer to your question, one might in fact bring in here the Gospel of John, because in chapter 20 of John, he's very keen on showing that after Jesus had died and had been resurrected, but was still on earth, as it were, his body was different. He could walk through doors without anything happening, as it were, and he does that twice in chapter 20. But he also tells Mary Magdalene that he is on his way to heaven. And hence she must not touch him, etc. That is from John's side, I think, a nice guess of what a resurrected body will actually be like. But I do also think that if one thinks about the contrast between pneuma and flesh, sarx in Paul, and the way he explains flesh, which is something that is tied to individuality, to each of us being this or the other person, then I guess that the resurrected human beings will not have very much of their customary individuality left. But this is a pure guess, and in this case, as I said, very risky comparison with John 20.
Sure. So let's transition to the Gospel of John.
Sure.
I guess so. A very common reading of Johannine Christology is sort of influenced by later Platonic early Christians, where
Right.
the Logos is something that is perhaps the first emanation from, the
Sure.
highest God.
Yeah.
And is a heavenly being who then voluntarily descends and becomes incarnate at the birth, probably, or the conception, maybe, in Mary.
Yeah.
And then there is a dual-natured, human divine person who then lives a human life, but is in some sense divine, and then dies, and then resurrects, and then returns from whence he came.
Right.
And that you can see that even pretty early, like Justin Martyr and other sort of the Platonic church fathers. So and Irenaeus, who claims to have some sort of direct connection through Polycarp to John.
Yeah.
Also, very much follows a Justin Martyr like
Right.
Platonic understanding. So how would a more Stoic understanding of pneuma and logos alter our kind of at a high level our understanding of what's going on in John, and then we can maybe dig into some particular verses and passages
Right.
and examples.
Right. I think the best thing is perhaps to take John chapter 1, where he, as it were, puts forward the germ of everything in the rest of the gospel. And this has to do with the relationship between the two concepts you mentioned, logos to begin with in the so-called prologue, and then pneuma, which takes up a certain or plays a huge role in the middle of chapter 1 after the prologue. As you said, and everybody knows, it is the logos that was to begin with God, and the logos that lay behind the creation of everything. And then in 1:14, the logos became flesh, the incarnation. One must ask oneself, what on earth, how does that, what sense does it make? What is the meaning of that? Is the logos identical with Jesus Christ? Is it Jesus Christ who in a way was with God to begin with? That's one question. Another question is, how may the logos, if we think of it more or less along the lines you indicated from the 2nd century, platonically, how may the logos, the material, something, become flesh? So there are a lot of questions and some uncertainty about what he actually wants to say. And many Christians then say, or scholars in particular, well, that's precisely the point. It's a mystery. Okay, I'm not so happy with that answer, because I don't really think that these writers were thinking in terms of mysteries like that. That's a sort of basic thing behind my whole work. I want, as far as possible, to find a more understandable and coherent answer to such questions than just to appoint something to be a mystery. And then I was struck by the fact that it may be that John is in fact using logos and the pneuma that Jesus precisely receives from above just after the prologue. He may be using those two terms in a quasi-Stoic way as two sides of the same coin. What this means is that the logos, and I would say the pneuma, was with God to begin with, because those things are part of God's creation, or those that generates the creation. They were with God to begin with. Jesus wasn't. Jesus was born by Mary, etc., etc. But then at a certain point, he came to John the Baptist, etc. And John the Baptist then bears witness. He doesn't actually baptize Jesus, and people emphasize that very much. But surely that's because it's God who baptizes Jesus. And God baptizes Jesus by sending the pneuma from above. And that means that he sends into Jesus's body an energy, a power, one might even say, and we can talk about how that power is shown in the rest of the gospel, and also a knowledge, the logos, the cognitive side of it. So Jesus both he has God's power, but he also knows what God's power is all about. And he knows that he himself has, as it were, been appointed to carry that power out among human beings. And when I had this idea, I noticed, which I hadn't done before, that in fact John the Baptist plays a double role, both in the prologue and also in that later passage. He appears twice in the prologue, and then he gets a bigger role in from 1:19 following. But if you look carefully at the way John describes him in 1:19 following, you will see that the first half of that corresponds to John the Baptist's first appearance in the prologue, and the second part of it corresponds to John's appearance in the second part of the prologue. And that means, you see, that when we come across in 1:19, John saying, I'm just looking it up here, he says,
this is the testimony given by John when the Jews
right.
sent priests and Levites from Jerusalem to ask him, who are you?
But he says, you say this is, and I don't quite know how you understand that, but what it says is kai haute estin, etc. And I think it means so. This is the message of, that is, he's explicitly, quasi-explicitly, going back to the prologue and spelling it out to us. So now we understand how the Logos became flesh, namely when Jesus was baptized by God, as God has had foretold John the Baptist, and as John the Baptist then bears witness to the Jews in general. So I think...
Go ahead.
No?
So the word becoming flesh is not the birth or the conception of Jesus, which, for the record, is never mentioned in the prologue of John. There's no mention of birth, no mention of Mary, no mention of a journey to Bethlehem or any of those things. And there is, we've already had events that are seemingly after Jesus's birth described in the prologue before we come to the word became flesh. So you're saying that the word become flesh is sort of like God infusing the human being Jesus with the pneuma logos, which is kind of both a power and also a knowledge at the same time.
Precisely.
At the baptism, and that is what's described later in chapter 1 when, the Spirit descends upon Jesus and at the baptism, and John is the one who bears witness of this event happening.
Yeah, exactly. And it's quite nice that you mentioned that John bears witness to it, because that means that John the Baptist has understood this thing happening. He knows, but that is precisely because God has actually told him. This is one of the few places in the Gospel of John where God is actually directly present and intervening. So John the Baptist, he knows, and he tells the Jews who are present, or whoever it was, and he tells also the reader, of course, that this is the way we should understand Jesus in this text. He is Jesus the Christ. and it happened in that particular way. And that leads into, if you are asking about, you asked me about, well, sort of the overall understanding of the Gospel of John in terms of this Stoicizing reading. That leads into, in fact, to the whole of the rest of the Gospel, because Jesus, he is the Son of God, in a very high sense, because he has received the pneuma and he knows it. He constantly walks around telling everybody that, as for instance, I and the Father are one in chapter 10. Dear me. But nobody understands it. Apart from John the Baptist, as we talked about, nobody understands it throughout the whole Gospel until chapter 20, namely Thomas. But that is precisely, and this is a slightly longer story, after Jesus has died and after he has begun to be turned into this pneuma, then Thomas understands it, and after also Jesus has given the pneuma to the disciples in chapter 20. Before that, not even the disciples understood what there was to be understood, and that the reader should, of course, understand this special thing about Jesus. And we could mention certain passages where John explicitly says that they didn't understand it or something like that, because the pneuma was not yet, since he had not been resurrected, doxaste.
The pneuma was not yet in his followers and his disciples, enabling them to see.
Precisely. And in fact, also he foretells them that, and now we are jumping a little ahead of everything to the so-called farewell speech in chapters 13 to 17. He foretells them that once he has left and gone to heaven, he will, either God or he will send another paraclete, namely the Spirit of truth, etc. And the whole point of that is that once that has happened, then they will understand. But that requires that he has died and has gone to heaven. So there is really, in this way, I think there is a basic story or fundamental theory underneath the whole of the Gospel of John that structures it in this particular way. Jesus has it and knows it. All those people he comes into contact with, they don't have it and they don't understand it.
Mm-hmm. Right. There's this constant theme of misunderstanding in John, where Jesus is interacting with someone. It could be Nicodemus. It could be the Samaritan woman at the well. It could be even his own followers or just sort of a crowd in general, right? He'll say something often kind of a little bit spiritual or mysterious. They react by saying, "What are you saying?" and kind of interpret it in sort of a literal or concrete way, right? Like, "You must eat my flesh and drink my blood." And they're like, "What?" Right? You know, or "You must be born again," and they're like, "How can you get back inside your mother's womb?" And right? And so those are two very, very good examples, you see, you took from chapter 6 about munching, eating Jesus' flesh, and chapter 3 on Nicodemus on being born again, because what they are actually about is receiving the pneuma. This is almost explicit in the discussion with Nicodemus where John actually mentions the pneuma, and this has to do with baptism from water and pneuma, and that is also the point that is brought out in chapter 6 about eating his flesh. That is precisely a total misunderstanding, but the correct understanding will be that they will be participating in the Eucharist, and there they will receive the pneuma.
So it's not munching. It's not what is it called when you eat animals? When you eat human beings.
Cannibalism.
It's not cannibalism. That's precisely the misunderstanding. But it is about eating something, and that is precisely what one gets in the Eucharist.
But through participating in the Eucharist, with bread and wine, that has some sort of spiritual connection to Jesus's body and blood, and it's sort of like bringing Jesus's pneuma into you through participation.
That's better. Because spiritual, the moment you say spiritual in that way, one begins to think along the Platonist lines. But it is precisely getting something you eat that has, one must guess this, been transformed by pneuma into your own body. So your own body is also being transformed. That's the sort
of... It's a way of becoming more like Christ.
Yeah. Precisely, but materialistically, not just spiritually.
Right. It's not like a spiritual metaphor.
No.
A spiritual, physical transformation of getting Jesus inside you.
Precisely. You got it.
And that's what's misunderstood in chapter 6. And when they say this is a hard saying, who can understand it, right?
Yeah, that's right. But you see, it's not just that it is misunderstood, but John goes out of his way to spell out that it is misunderstood in order to tell his reader how it should be correctly understood. That's so wonderful. That's a sort of strategy that he has all through. You mentioned Nicodemus. You mentioned the Samaritan woman. It's very interesting to look at these individuals, the way he treats them, because they begin from totally not understanding, but gradually they move in the direction. The Samaritan woman, she comes back to the people in the village. And she says, might he be the Christ? Which is quite interesting. She doesn't know. She hasn't got the pneuma, etc., to fully understand. But she has been moving in that direction. Nicodemus, of course, he turns up later in the Gospel, and which indicates that he has understood something. And that, I think, also a very important element in John's version of the story.
Yes. So there, but some people hear and reject, right? Or hear and respond in anger.
Absolutely.
And malice.
Yes. But those are the Jews. And as you may or may not know, there is a huge discussion in scholarship about how to understand the Jews. I have a special take on that, which consists in saying the following. It's very simple. The Jews, people have been speculating, does he mean the Judeans, those coming from Judea, etc.? But that doesn't really fit. And other proposals have been made, and they don't either fit. And of course, the whole aim of that is to exonerate John from criticizing Judaism as such. That is a worthy agenda, but it hasn't really helped so much. I think it's pretty clear. We were talking about the Samaritan woman. She's a Samaritan, but Nicodemus is not. He is a Jew. So I think the simplest answer is that the Jews are those Jews who did not accept Jesus as the Christ. And of course we know that very many Jews didn't do that. But so this might be read as saying that the Gospel of John is not at all directed against Judaism, because there are evidently Jews, like in Paul. There is a Jew named Paul himself.
Even when Jesus is speaking to the Samaritan woman, Jesus says something like, we Jews worship what we know, in contrast to the Samaritan. And so Jesus, we the Jews worship correctly. Right?
You're quite right. So it is possible that one should understand it in this way, that the Jews are only those Jews who did not, and that means that the rest of the Jews are, as it were, okay. But it is certainly also possible that John has taken the step away from Judaism and is part of the generation of creation of this new religion, Christianity. I think basically that one cannot decide, but I think that is interesting in itself, and at least one should keep one's mind open to both possibilities.
Sure. So another question I have for you, in John, there are some statements where Jesus seems to suggest that he existed either eternally or before his current existence, where he'll say something, what if you see the Son of Man ascending to where he was before, John 6:62, and then of course very famously in John 8:58, before Abraham was, I am. So how would you make sense of those statements in John?
But I think the answer there is very simple in a way. Jesus, on my reading of what happened in chapter 1, Jesus, the human being bought by Mary, etc., was not present to begin with. What was present was the logos, the pneuma, etc. Once that has descended upon Jesus, then he has become Jesus Christ. And then it is correct to say of this entity, Jesus Christ, that it was present to begin with, because the logos and the pneuma were there to begin with. So it's also correct to have Jesus say of himself that before Abraham was born, I was, or I am even, where he emphasizes his very close connection with God himself. Precisely because this is Jesus Christ who is speaking. It's not just Jesus, the person, the human being born in Nazareth. So this I think is really part of my interpretation of what happens in chapter 1, and shouldn't cause a problem.
Right. So Jesus, in a certain sense, can speak as a man, because also in John 8, Jesus will say, "Why do you seek to kill me, a man who told you the words I heard from God?" Right? Jesus saying, he calls himself an anthropos, right, and distinguishes himself from God, the one whose words he is reciting.
Absolutely.
But then 18 verses later or something like that, he's saying, "Before Abraham was, I am." So in a certain sense, he can speak as to his human identity, which is an ordinary human. But he can also speak with this sort of pneumatic Christos identity of the Spirit of God that in some sense predates him and has been around before Abraham and was in heaven before it descended upon him.
Yes, that's right. And it's important, and I think you're right in emphasizing that Jesus does behave and speak also as a human being, a man, because that is part of my interpretation of John, that we should not see the Jesus who is performing throughout the gospel as a famous German scholar, Ernst Käsemann, said, a God walking above the earth or something like that. No. He is a human being, but one who also has the logos pneuma in him and acts on the basis of that, while also still being a human being. This is here, of course, here we are touching with something absolutely central on how to imagine the Jesus who is behaving, etc., and walking around in the Gospel of John. But I think we should try to resist asking for more clarification than we already have, that he is a human being who became the Jesus Christ by getting the pneuma and the logos, and is for that reason carrying that around. We shouldn't try to say more, because in a way there isn't more to be said. I should have thought, but of course people can always ask questions about it. Might I add here that You have asked several times here, what do we gain from understanding Jesus' reception of the pneuma in terms of Stoicism, etc. One thing that I'm very keen on showing in that book of mine is that we can also understand how John conceptualizes Jesus' speech, because that is to be understood as Jesus literally saying something that comes out of his mouth. But
with his breath.
With
right?
his breath and everything.
When you speak, you breathe it out.
Absolutely.
And breath and pneuma are the same word.
Precisely.
Right? Yeah.
That's right. But that was my point, as it were, that at the same time as it comes out of his mouth, it is also, as it were, an expression of the pneuma that he has in him. So at the same time, it's just, literal words, which incidentally is something that John calls rhemata, and that means literally just words coming out of somebody's mouth. But it is also those rhemata, those words are also an expression of the logos, God's logos, in fact, in certain passages. And that evidently means the point of the whole thing, the plan behind the world as a whole and behind Jesus's coming, etc., etc. So I think it's interesting to see that you can, if you adopt this quasi-Stoic pneumatic interpretation, you can find in what John is saying about Jesus' speech, you can find both the human purely human part of it, and also the special Christ-like pneumatic part of it. It's tied so intimately together.
Right, and so when Jesus says stuff like, my words did not find a home in you, or that sort of thing, right? Like the way that Jesus's spirit can get inside you is that the pneuma logos, right, comes out, right? You hear it as words, but it's also quite literally and physically breath coming out from him.
That's right.
And you can receive it, or you could not receive it.
Yeah.
And when you receive it, Jesus's words and breath get inside you, and then you can be born from above and have the Spirit come in you that you received from Jesus.
Yeah.
And then even a disciple or an apostle can be someone then who gets it inside them that they could continue to spread it.
Yeah.
Right. And there's this daisy chain spreading of God pneuma logos through Jesus talking.
Yeah, I wouldn't go quite so far, because I do think that it's enormously important that the pneuma and the logos, etc., comes out of Jesus's mouth and is then heard by some people listening to him. But I don't think that John has the idea that through that hearing, the pneuma also comes to be present in the listener, because there's something different that is required for that, something that can in fact only happen after Jesus has died, and that is being baptized or attending the Eucharist. Once you have that, then you have the pneuma within you, and then you can fully understand what it was that he said, as it were.
I see.
Yeah, okay. So, and I think it's actually a quite refined way of thinking about interaction and evidently about this particular person, Christ, interacting with human beings. It's not just pistis faith, belief in. There are, I believe, two types of faith, and the second one is backed up by having pneuma. So it's if I can just add one little thing that I love, this is the very last verse of the whole Gospel of John, if one doesn't include chapter 21. But at the end of chapter 20, he says, these things are written in order that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that, believing that, you will have life in his name. Now, there is a famous difficulty in the text here when it says these things are written in order that you may believe. In that case, one would think that the idea is that the Gospel of John is addressed to people who are not believing. And so they hear the gospel, etc., and they believe. And that that is an interpretation that would follow from understanding this. Well, this is technical as an aorist conjunctive here. But if it means, and you take it then as a present conjunctive, that in order that you may keep believing, that is strengthening the belief that was there already. I think the latter interpretation is much better, and I think it actually presupposes what the gospel has told all through, that these people must have the pneuma. Then they will fully understand and believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and then they will also have life, because of course in John 2 life is eternal life is generated by the pneuma.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes very good sense. So one verse that I want to ask you about is, so just a couple of verses earlier, Thomas says, "My Lord and my God," and you sort of alluded to that earlier as Thomas coming to full realization. So what does it mean that Thomas calls Jesus my Lord and my God?
What it means,
what does it mean with regards to Christ? Is he calling Jesus, his God? Or
yes, I think it's a highly potent both place and expression. You see, at the end of the prologue in 1:18, it is written that nobody has seen God ever, but the monogenes theos, the one who is in the bosom of the Father, he has spelled it out. There Jesus is described by John as what is it? How to translate monogenes?
Only begotten.
The only begotten. The only begotten God. And this is hugely important, right in that place. But it sort of indicates that what really matters, once you have yourself received the pneuma, and once you understand all this that Jesus is doing and saying in the Gospel of John, including when he is saying that I and the Father am one, then you are actually able to address Jesus Christ as my Lord and my God. And if you then say, what is the relationship then between God and Christ, if they are both gods, as it were? I don't think that there is any either complicated or specific answer to that question. They are so close to one another that one may then finally call Jesus Christ God. But it doesn't in any way take away from the fact that Jesus is himself constantly speaking about the Father as being distinct from himself. In my Father's world there are several rooms, etc., etc. He speaks again and again like that, distinguishing between the two. And that remains in place. At the same time, once you have really obtain this understanding that the pneuma will give you, then you can also address Jesus Christ as my God.
Mm-hmm. I guess one further clarification question is: are you addressing Jesus as my God as a divinized human, right? Like a begotten God, that Jesus has become so infused with pneuma that he's essentially a divinized human? or are you sort of addressing the pneuma in Jesus that is God, right? Like God, basically God the Father's pneuma in Jesus as your God.
A fine question. I think the answer is in the second way, because at that point, it's really at that point, once Jesus has died and been resurrected, it's in a way immaterial to the whole story that he also was a human being. At that point, I think the pneuma has taken over completely, and here also taken over in Thomas in such a way that he can address Jesus in that way. You see, the Gospel of John says of God that he is pneuma in chapter 4. He also clearly envisages Jesus Christ, the risen Jesus Christ, as being next to God in heaven. He also, I believe, clearly envisages Jesus Christ as coming to be present on earth as the Spirit of truth, that is the pneuma, etc., the Paraclete, and eventually as the entity that will generate the resurrection of all believers. So at that, those different stages in the story, Jesus' humanity is of no concern any longer.
Sure. And I think that this is my last question for you. So how would you sort of overall summarize John's Christology? And how does that fit into labels that are either kind of from the early Christian period or that we use now to describe the early Christian period, such as like Trinitarian, Arian, Gnostic, Docetic, Adoptionist, Monarchian, right? There are all these different labels for different forms of Christology.
Yeah.
And do you not like using those labels, or do you feel like it fits in?
No, I don't.
Go ahead.
No, because I think one has to precisely read the text itself through the kind of discussion we have been having. There, how should we understand it there? There, how should we understand it there? And then, as it were, generate the understanding in your own mind that comes out of that. But to use a label of that kind is, I think, only confusing. And if I may say, Trinitarian or Arian or what was it? Anyway, Trinitarian or Arian much later. They are of no help to understand the Gospel of John. Docetic or Gnostic or Docetic, definitely no, because those are versions of Platonism, some kind of transformed Platonism, and that doesn't fit at all my understanding of John. You said adoptionist also, and you might say, if we go back to John chapter 1, I believe, we haven't really talked about it, but we could, that the Gospel of John is very much closer to the Gospel of Mark. That is the first Gospel that we have. In a way I can perhaps explain very quickly. And in Mark, you do have an understanding of Christ that is also connected with baptism and the pneuma, and that might well be called adoptionist. So if that is true, and if John is, well, similar to Mark in this particular respect, we might use that term. But I don't know that we gain very much from it. So I would rather prefer not to use all those labels. On that little thing about, which is not a small thing, but about John and Mark, you may have heard of the so-called messianic secret in the Gospel of Mark, which is totally important in that Gospel, and I think that Mark invented it. It has two basic elements. The first is that Jesus walks around and he heals, etc., and then he tells everybody that they must not tell anybody else about him and how they were healed. So that's the secret part.
Especially not that he's the Christ.
No, precisely.
Right? Or the
precisely,
Son of God.
Precisely.
Especially not that.
Yeah, precisely.
Yeah.
On the other hand, the other theme is that there are a huge amount of people around, and they don't understand what, and that is an important theme also in Mark. They don't understand it, even though it should be clear everybody, even though Jesus say that they mustn't tell it, it should be clear. Okay, so those are the two elements in the Messianic secret in Mark. What John has done is to take over those and then turn them upside down. Because here Jesus walks around and he constantly tells everybody what they should understand, but still they don't understand it. So that's a very elegant...
No need to keep it secret if people can't understand what you're saying anyway.
That's right. And the reason why they cannot understand it is that the pneuma wasn't there yet, etc. Once it comes, everybody should be able to understand it. People also can understand it, and in particular, the reader can understand it. It's so much geared to the reader, I think. Mm-hmm. May I then conclude now, because we cannot continue any longer. But it's as I said, it's left to the reader. Here is the book I wrote about. I don't know if you can see it.
Yeah.
And there's
John and Philosophy.
John and Philosophy. There's a very, very beautiful painting by Piero della Francesca in Italy, where you see the evangelist. And what struck me when I saw it down in Italy is the red book that he is holding there. What it means to me is that. And this, I think, we have also sort of touched on several times here, that one has primarily to read this text itself, and of course to think about it, etc., instead of believing beforehand that one understands what it's all about. So that's really my message to anybody: read this text.
Yeah. Well, that sounds like a great place to stop. Thank you very much, Professor Engberg-Pedersen. I really appreciate it, and I'm sure that my listeners will have too.
That's great.